Hello, and welcome to the No Bad Questions podcast, where I try to learn in a conversational manner by sitting down with people who have interesting careers, important lessons to tell, or inspiring stories. I hope that you learn something too. If you want to support the podcast, please follow or subscribe on your platform of choice. You can also like or comment to boost the algorithms or share out to your network to make sure it gets more views. But ultimately, and what I hope you choose to do, is listen to the very end. With that, we'll start today's podcast. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the No Bad Questions podcast. My guest today is Dr. Brad Archer. He is the Chief Medical Officer at Monument Health in Rapid City, South Dakota. Monument is a 5-hospital system serving western South Dakota and portions of neighboring Nebraska, Wyoming, Montana, and North Dakota. After completing pharmacy school at South Dakota State University, he went on to attend the University of South Dakota School of Medicine, where he earned his medical doctorate degree. Following med school, Dr. Archer completed his residency training in internal medicine at the University of Iowa Des Moines internal medicine residency program, and a master's degree from Dartmouth. Dr. Archer practiced in Des Moines for several years before he started a palliative care program and directed value-based efforts, including participating in the Pioneer Accountable Care Organization model, which those of you not in healthcare will have no idea what that is, but that's all right. He was an assistant professor of internal medicine and the director of population health at the University of Iowa Hospitals and Clinics, and served as the chief clinical officer for the University of Iowa Health Alliance before moving to South Dakota. Outside of all of that work in the medical space, Dr. Archer enjoys hiking and mountain biking and is also actively involved in his community. And one of the reasons he's joined me today is because he's also written a book. And so let's start there. First of all, thank you for joining me here on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, David.
And let's talk about, you've written a book. It's on strategy. I took a look through the draft you sent me. It looks like it's focused on healthcare strategy, but why this book? Why now? What did you feel like there's many books on strategy. What are you adding to the equation?
So I think most of the strategy books out there, and I think you're right, there are some really good ones focused on the importance of defining who you are through your mission statements, defining how you do things through your organizational structure. You know, an essential component that I've discovered over the years in terms of defining who you are with that mission statement is defining what that competitive position is. You know, and without that, I think, and there are lots of examples out there where companies have failed to define it. Human nature will define it. The market will define it. Certain psychological characteristics of both individuals and teams will define what that competitive position is, and that will lead to certain actions that may or may not be ultimately supportive of what you want for your organization's viewpoint in terms of how it's viewed by the public, by customers, by competition, and by the people who work within the company. And so it's important to, and one of the things I've learned, and so this is a lecture that came that I developed as I was doing some occasional lecturing at the university in the MHA program, specifically around the importance of having that competitive position well defined. And I just hadn't seen a lot of other attention, a lot of other books that paid attention to that specifically.
What do you think that organizations and leaders get wrong about strategy then?
Well, without a competitive position within that strategy, again, you run into the gamut of potential responses, and so there's sort of a natural spectrum, really, of competitive responses that run from what would normally be considered positive responses in terms of simply providing better products, better services, better, more attention to detail, improvements on existing products and services, and then innovation, really formation of brand new ways to handle problems. And those are all, generally on that positive sort of end of the spectrum. Of course, there's a negative end of that spectrum as well, that involves things that would be typically more either personal attacks or more negative type of influences. And you see those in a number of different areas, where there's lack of clarity. Human nature will lend itself to that full spectrum usually. And so it's important to know and think about what are the potential outcomes of that. So if you've got a situation where really you have a mutually beneficial relationship with some of your competition, you certainly wouldn't want your employees, exhibiting the negative end of that spectrum. Certainly not in a public sense, and probably not even within the company itself, to anything that would influence or bias their behaviors. And I think there are other times when, if you're looking at potentially eliminating your competition from the market, there's two ways to do that. One is to try to close them down, in which case maybe some of those negative things or would be more tolerable in those cases. But more and more, especially in healthcare, we see that biggest form of elimination is actually merger and partnership, being acquired. And in those cases, certainly splitting your cultures and making definitive statements ahead of time about and highlighting the differences maybe between two organizational structures is certainly not going to be helpful later when you're trying to merge those structures and look for synergies and look for opportunities for those groups to work together. So it requires some forethought, and certainly in medicine, as you will know as well, that today's competition is often tomorrow's partner. So it's important, I think, for all of us to be aware of that as we design our strategic planning processes and understand exactly not only what it is that we're looking from an outcome for, and what the future is likely to hold for us.
There's two euphemisms out there about other things that defeat strategy. The first is, culture eats strategy for breakfast. And then the other, which probably originates with Sun Tzu, which is this idea that terrain trumps strategy. The battle is won based on movements of your troops ahead of time, right? And so geography and the terrain, I think in this case, is the political landscape, the geographic landscape, all these things in which an organization is operating. Then culture's culture. I think we all know what that is. Do you, in your writings in this book, and forgive me for not having been able to dive into it in the time I had ahead of us, because I know it's fairly brief, do you get into how those other elements might defeat strategy, or strategy can work with those elements, or you really focus on, as you mentioned, that competitive positioning?
Well, I think it's how I address that probably is thinking that really everything, most every component of your strategic plan has a competitive aspect to it. Mm. Ultimately, on a high level, businesses are often find themselves competing for legitimacy. You're competing for legitimacy within the market. You're competing for legitimacy with your customers. You're competing for that recognition anyway of legitimacy. And so that's one way to think about. I think that the competition is not just purely around the product itself or the service itself directly, but it's around the perception of your company and the perception of how you deliver those products and services. And so in healthcare specifically, often it is you've got various components of the healthcare system that are sort of naturally in balance in competition for those dollars. You've got the insurance companies, the healthcare providers, which of course then subdivide into hospitals, physician groups, multi-specialty groups, and other ancillary healthcare provider groups, and then you've got all the supply chain components that relate to healthcare as well, that ultimately are competing in some way for those same resources. And part of what we are often find ourselves engaged in is that is that battle for legitimacy as you look to control that terrain, so to speak. And really a lot of that terrain has to do. I mean, there's the direct control of a certain specialty area or direct control of contractual leverage, those kind of things. But often as you're looking to provide service, especially in this area with patients who are members of a health plan, there's a natural competition for legitimacy, between the insurance company and the provider in terms of where does case management live, what kind of utilization management strategies are at play, and ultimately the consumer, the patient or the member, will be the determining, will be the judge of that. And so I really encourage more of a broader view of exactly what it is you're competing around, and again, that includes more of a ideological competition as well. And it's one, interestingly, that I think historically we have assumed on the provider side that we have held that upper ground. And lately, we see that changing. Lately, we see ourselves being challenged. Even in the lay press, our charges to commercial insurance companies fair and balanced as compared to government, charges and fee schedules. As now we see the mergers occurring and these sort of mega systems, emerging, that even though they're not for profit, their balance sheets are getting pretty large, and that changes public perception of them. When health systems and hospitals were the little guys, so to speak, against some of as the insurance companies grew, that changes people's position, perception of your competitive position in the market. If you're a big health system and you've got leverage, I mean, then there's the perception that you are the little guy is no longer the case. And in fact, we see some of that changing, at least from what I can tell, in the press, as we see conversations occurring even at Washington, D.C. now about potentially limiting, hospitals' ability to charge commercial insurance over a certain, percent of charges or over a certain rate. And those are discussions that I don't think would have taken place a few years ago. So that's an example, I think, of where that competition for legitimacy maybe the needle has shifted a bit from providers to payers in this sense.
And that's interesting. Well, a lot of what you said in there is interesting, but I like your use of the word legitimacy. And I was going to say that my impression is actually that providers have long been losing the legitimacy battle because, of some of the things you are mentioning. I think I feel like I've seen them coming for a decade. We see the bitter pill from Time Magazine and the charge. And don't get me wrong, there are some providers out there who, in the name of margin or in the name of something else, have been bad actors. But I think that as a whole, speaking in aggregate, providers have, at least hospital providers, maybe the individual, family doctor in the community has done a better job of legitimacy. But I just don't know that hospital-based providers have won that battle, because we are seeing some of this about restricting mergers and acquisitions. We are seeing laws that either are being talked about or have been passed, clamping down on various provider behaviors and requiring disclosures that perhaps other members, looking at PBM, don't have to be as transparent as some of us. And I actually think with the feds publishing some rules this year on the Part C plans, I was actually thinking it was going the other way a little bit, where maybe some folks are realizing that, yes, your local hospital has put up a very big multi-million-dollar tower, and that's very visible in your community. And gosh, aren't they huge and have lots of money? But earlier this year, the earnings reports for some of the largest, healthcare systems in the country were negative operating margins, and they were record high margins for some of the big payers. So I think that might actually be shifting the other way. So not to push back too much, but I mean, what do you think about that contention?
I am shocked actually at what I see as sort of the lack of recognition, even though the headlines are, as you
Mm,
say, they're very obvious. I mean, we've got, our major health systems reporting, losses in the billions last year, and are expected to do so again this year. Margins were running in that 1 to 2% range prior to the pandemic on average, and now they've dropped to negative,
hmm
and are expected to stay that way again this year, which really threatens the viability of a lot of the not-for-profit hospitals out there. And I'm surprised at sort of the lack of of alarm that seems to be causing in the country. Even though it's you can get on the internet and pretty quickly
hmm
search for health systems and operating margins and see that those are in serious trouble. I have yet to really hear the call or the alarm being sounded. I think I saw an article that suggested there were 435 hospitals across the country at risk this year. That's probably an underestimate, in my opinion, but that's
Yep.
what the article suggested, and of closing. And that probably doesn't count the hospitals that are looking at a potential merger. There
Merge.
was a time when, even a few years, just a very few years ago, when typically it was more your 500, 600 million, net revenue hospitals and below that were the ones sort of getting acquired. And now you see billion-dollar, health systems getting acquired by multi-billion-dollar health
Yeah.
systems. And there was a thought at one point that, gets being somewhere in that kind of, 1 to 4 billion range was really kind of maybe the ideal in terms of capturing efficiency and the ability to share some of those back office resources. And that's being questioned. And you're seeing now some of these mega mergers occurring with systems that are across pretty large geographic spans that really aren't going to be in a position to directly share a lot of on-site resources. And so you have to ask yourself, well, are those really mergers designed to decrease back office costs, or are they mergers designed to increase market power?
Right. That's very fair. And actually, I was going to say, let me step back from my almost perpetual stance of provider accuracy and say, I mean, I've seen just anecdotally in my personal life, when receiving care or my family receiving care, I do think in the name of staying afloat, some organizations are undertaking not negligent tactics or anything, but just, hey, what's the fewest staff we can get by with? Hey, what's the most patients we can cram through this office in a day? And that's been slowly ramping up over the last decade, but I think it's really been accelerated with the COVID years. And so you've recently given some talks on healthcare sustainability, and this is where, if anybody's listening and has zoned out because we were too much in the weeds on healthcare strategy, I think healthcare sustainability is for everybody. Because if you don't have a doctor, if you don't have a hospital in your community, this impacts you, right? So tune back in. Do you think American healthcare, by and large, is sustainable on its current trajectory, or do we need some sort of tidal shift in how we're doing things?
Yeah, I mean, I do think I think we need a title shift. I think they've been telling me my whole career, telling us that care is going to move from the inpatient realm to the outpatient,
Mm-hmm.
and that we should stop building beds, hospital beds. And so every consultant firm you get in as you're looking at a building project tells you not to build beds, and then you whatever you build, you fill instantly, and then we say we should have built more beds. And part of that is because, at the same time that we were having these conversations, interventional medical technology was increasing dramatically. The average age of our patients was decreasing dramatically. I think when I was in training, the idea of 80-year-olds in the ICU was, it was an exception, not a rule. And now that's, now you see that much more routinely. Life expectancy has increased, and the quality of that life expectancy has arguably improved, at least somewhat. But the amount of technology that we have to diffuse amongst the population that's now living longer has just created a lot more need and challenge for those inpatient resources. And at the same time, from a provider side, we just have not been appropriately financially motivated to move anything to the
Mm-hmm.
outpatient world where it pays significantly less. And I'm naturally inclined and have to, frankly, for a number of reasons pertaining to urgencies and emergencies related to certain medical conditions, required to have my specialists on call in the hospital through the ED. I'm required to have specialist consultations available within the hospital. And so to duplicate that entire sort of on-call or readiness type of system in an outpatient setting is really expensive. And on top of it, I'm rewarded by getting paid significantly less to provide that service in an outpatient setting. And so we just haven't really been appropriately motivated to make that move. I think that's one of the advantages of the financial crisis or crunch that we're seeing now in healthcare, in that I have a built-in value-based motivation now as a provider to look for alternative sources, cheaper sources of care. For the last decade or so, we've been talking about value-based care as a potential answer, but so often as we're talking about value-based care and we talk about total cost of care, it's the truth behind that is that's the insurance company profit margin
Mm-hmm.
that we're talking about that gets impacted, not what I do, since I'm paid on fee for service.
Right.
And there, that total cost of care reduction is actually a loss in my revenue. And so we just haven't had although we've had the dialogue created around, I think, how to work together, through the value-based care efforts. I don't think that the financial forces really were aligned to incentivize us to appropriately move those inpatient services to an outpatient setting. And I do think that's one of the advantages that we see now, is that we're gonna have that motivation. Part of the problem, however, is this sort of acute recognition of a chronic problem has left us without a lot of investment capital
Mm-hmm.
to make that move. That's going to be an expensive move. And so I think our opportunity is for, particularly on the payer side, to work with health systems. And you see that happening. There's definitely evidence of some vertical partnerships occurring, where payers recognize that if they can help a health system effectively move service lines, provide different sorts of reimbursement mechanisms and compensation mechanisms to their providers, that we can make those moves, and that's one of maybe the good things, because that the amount that it took to do that, to overcome the potential loss of what we used to get on the inpatient side, is now disappearing as our
Mm-hmm.
margins shift to negative, and it becomes very costly for us to care for patients in our highest cost centers.
Do you so in all this, in the strategy and the competitive positioning to execute that strategy, and the landscape and the culture and the terrain and the payers and the providers, what are your concerns that the patient gets lost in all that? I think healthcare has been forced to mature as a business, because it is. Those listening may not like that it's a business, but it is. I mean, I've joked in the past that there was never a free doctor. Go back 500 years and you still gave him a chicken, to come and treat you. It's still a business. The person giving the care has to earn a living. It's just become so much more complex and sophisticated in the modern age. But I do worry that in trying to stay afloat for our communities in aggregate and help our patients in aggregate, we risk losing the individual patient. And that goes back to, like I said, trying to churn a lot of volume, or, operate with minimal staffing. I worry that we'll have more small misses, but small misses add up when it comes to outcomes. Do you think that's well founded? Do you think that is, am I astray in my thinking?
No, I think I agree with you. Fee for service certainly drove that, and we still fight that. Our whole physician compensation mechanism has oversight from the OIG at the government level, and if I stray from MGMA averages on compensation, which are all based on production, then suddenly I risk a multi-million-dollar lawsuit from the government,
Mhm.
and penalties, so it becomes very difficult to innovate within that structure. And that's really the promise that I see initially in some of the experiments that I've seen with between payers, providers, maybe in some cases direct to employer type arrangements, where you see us moving away from in those models from fee for service, and you see us moving more to a panel management. Health coaching, being incorporated into the sort of the team-based care concept, particularly at the primary care level. And those are encouraging. Those are really encouraging models that we see out there. And I think some of our governmental agencies are making some moves in that direction too. I think the VA has made some moves into more of a management concept
Mhm.
over a panel. And of course, that's what patients want too. That's what we want. We want someone who's looking out for our health, whether I make an appointment in the office or whether, like most men, I do not. I don't keep up with what I'm doing. It's nice. It's nice to have that case management applied across the board, even from a preventative care standpoint. And I think that's been some of the awareness that's been raised through some of these ACO models as well within the value-based realm. So I think there's some great dialogue that's been created. I think there's some great examples out there for us to follow. What we need is to accelerate those models, because let's face it, the bulk of care in the country is still delivered on this fee for service model. And I think our opportunity to shift that is definitely there. And it's funny, a lot of the innovation that you see is really happening because of some of the private equity
Mhm.
aggregators and who are getting involved with some of the primary care docs, especially, and really driving a different care model altogether. And I think that there's just a lot that we could learn from that. And hopefully there's still time left for us to change the model of delivery of care that we have. And I think those vertical and horizontal partnerships allow us some opportunities to do that. So in those headlines of losses and threats and concerns, there's also a lot of positive headlines as well.
Back to your book and the points about competition. So many of us are competing for labor now, not only market share and patients, but for labor and talent. There's a shortage of physicians. There's a shortage of nurses. There's a shortage of environmental services people. There's a shortage of everyone. What, and I think particularly with the inflationary situation that we have now, money is, raw pay is top of mind for a lot of folks, but maybe particularly in healthcare where we can't just raise prices. We're not a grocery store. We can't just add to the cost of eggs, right? And we get paid kind of what we get paid. We're price takers, as I think the economists would say. So how do we keep up and stay competitive for labor? What thoughts do you have on strategies for competitiveness on the labor front?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think that speaks back to kind of your initial statements about where this competitive positioning fits. Two basic questions I always boil down from a business to look at businesses or well, who are they and how do they do things? And everyone asks that internally as well, and whether that's stated or not, it's certainly the thing that everybody seeks to understand when they come into an organization. And clearly, those are the elements, especially in healthcare. We've seen some competitiveness for wages in some areas, but there's also a lot of, just as you said, sort of natural limitations on the system. We had some traveler and still have some traveler variation day to day. That I think there's an app out there that allows you to even have competition shift to shift for
Wow.
some nursing and technical areas. We haven't used it here, but I know that it exists out there and allows workers to be able to even sell themselves off at whatever to the highest bidder on a shift basis. Those hasn't taken off dramatically at this point, and there's some flexibility there. But as you pointed out, we're self limited into just how much we can do there. Physician pay is, again, has definite governmental limits, based on the survey data that we have to follow. And so, other than a physician's ability to increase their productivity to a point where they can control their salary that way, we're really stuck within those percentile rankings, and there's a lot of scrutiny if you cross over that 75th, as you get over the 75th percentile. And so there's limitations there for us as well, which makes it a bit more of an even playing field, which adds to that level of competition, really. So it is about addressing those cultural elements of who you are and how you do things. And for healthcare providers, a lot of it is there's an innate sense of volunteerism that just comes along with the job, and it's there. And I think it's you can have a set of organizational principles that guides the organization that feel very acquiescent in their application. And we have a lot of regulatory issues and
right.
Payer contractual issues and so forth that lend themselves to that. But we're lucky in healthcare that, again, there's just this natural, we have this ability to help people and to get that immediate gratification from that, which is pretty unique. I think a lot of businesses don't have that. And so for us, it's inherent. The competition becomes how can we drive and accentuate that spirit of volunteerism and that feedback that people get that feeds why they went into the profession in the first place, versus that sort of culture of acquiescence that develops where you have to check the boxes and check the lists,
right.
And have a either risk or reward kind of basis on whether you meet those criteria. Some of those things are important, but I think it's also important for us not to get too carried away in medicine with those types of incentive plans, and instead really focus more on wellness, the aspects around the job, again, that lend themselves to the feelings that make you feel good about getting up and going to work every day. And that's some of the differences you see, I think, as you try to become more and more efficient, and as we try to use the principles from other production line level businesses, and we try to bring those in with Lean Six Sigma and so forth, and back to the the sort of the Toyota manufacturing process concept that Virginia Mason brought in. Some great concepts with that in terms of thinking more in terms of system thinking and process thinking. But on the other hand, it can detract from what really drives us in this work. And so I think it's important for us to remember that that the things that motivate humans to help other people are the things that need to be celebrated. And along with that, I think the making sure that your organizational structure supports, while we have to have some acquiescent components to our day-to-day work, I think that it's important for us to support the self-actualized kind of concepts that drive a profession. And that's true of we've got so many professions that come together in healthcare, nursing, right, pharmacy, every level of technician now, and they're becoming increasingly sophisticated and specific in terms of some of the things that we offer folks. And so each of those carries with it its personal satisfaction in being one of very few people, usually in a community, who have that particular skill set. And although it can also be you can think of it as a lever for income, it's also however a lever for personal satisfaction. And it's incumbent on us as healthcare systems to not get carried away in our acquiescent policies, but to inspire professionalism at every opportunity that we get.
I think that's a good point on the trying to inspire people back to, I think you brought up a couple times in there about why they got into this profession. I was talking with Dr. Robert Wagner, who's an ED physician. And, when I was arranging for him to come on the podcast, I knew Dr. Wagner and I could detect a lot of burnout. And by the time we recorded the podcast, I think he was in good shape. He'd had an opportunity to step away, to have a vacation, to realize, to highlight the moments in his day that were why he wanted to be an ER doc and to focus on those. And I'm sure he still has, I haven't talked to him for a little while, but still has those moments that are like dragging an anchor, through the workday. But those moments that he's able to focus on purpose. And that's actually an interesting question, I think, for not just healthcare, but for any business is, and particularly as I feel like I see articles all the time about how our younger workforce that's entering, or our younger generation that's entering the workforce is very purpose driven. So I don't know that healthcare used to be it was more rare that it was more purpose driven. An accountant maybe is, unless they're a particularly motivated accountant, is not going in for the purpose driven life. They're going in because it's a good living and they're good with numbers and, things like that. Now I think there's a lot of purpose driven life across industries. And so what I'm wondering, all of that is to say, as part of that competitive positioning, that strategy, trying to bring it back for you, I'm wondering what strategies are out there, and we don't have to solve for this on this conversation, but to find ways to highlight that for your team members. Because when you're in the thick of it, when you're in the trenches, it can be awful hard to note that you've made patient X's day, right? They were afraid and you gave them some comfort and now they're not afraid, or something like that. And that's true, again, not just of physicians, but of any role in the organization, and probably across industries, is how do we tie back to that purpose on a routine basis for our staff members? I don't often hear that dialogue in leadership conversations. We're talking about benefits and pension and pay and how do we recruit and how do we retain, all good things. But I think that moments to highlight purpose is something we could all focus on. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. If not, like I said, we don't have to solve for that on this conversation, but any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I wouldn't have said this when it first came out and I first read it, because I was probably one of those, since I'm given my age, the type of training we had, it was more of a hero complex sort of training. You're the doctor, you're in charge. And now we have a much more team-based concept that's being trained all the way from medical school. And part of that's just necessity. I mean, when I went to pharmacy school, there were probably, a tenth of the drugs that are actually on the market today. So, I mean, this is the explosion in technology and knowledge out there requires team-based care. The complexity of navigating the financial system, a prior authorization and clearance for a surgical procedure, for instance, can mean the difference between, a patient, actually having a procedure and maybe not having it, if it's seen as being potentially financially burdensome to them, or worse yet, having it and then later realizing that they're now in lifelong financial difficulty because the process wasn't completed as it should have been. And so it only takes a couple of those as a physician that you run into. And, the last thing you want to do is get somebody in chronic financial stress, which then, of course, manifests in their health, at some point. And so I think we have just generally within the industry transformation over the last 20 years that's been impressive, away from that kind of individual act of heroism kind of mentality to a team-based model of care that includes all members of the team, including revenue cycle and documentation, coding, all those folks I think are really important. And the complexity of medicine that we got to hide from a little bit more, I think in the paper days, has become a little bit more apparent to all of us through the electronic medical records. So I think that's probably been helpful for us as well. I think today's docs are just maybe a little more sophisticated in that sense than they were, and again out of necessity, because things have changed and because things have gotten so complex and so expensive. So I see some optimism there, really, in terms of where we have migrated to, and I think and where we're going to have to continue to, because that's not that the technology continues to explode. I mean, just the genomic, movement out there alone is creating a whole nother area of medicine that, is going to require even more, understanding and investment and more team members, involved as we look to, some of those new technologies. So I think we're forced to do that. I think payers can help us too in that regard. I think we've seen kind of a shift back and forth. There was a big movement for a while in the 2000s for payers to get much more involved on the care management side of things. And then we saw maybe a switch back towards utilization management strategies because they were more immediately effective quarter to quarter. And now I think we're seeing that pendulum, kind of swing back the other way. And again, a lot of that has to do with some of the dialogue that's been created around value-based care. So I hope that, in the future, there continues to be this evolution towards this team-based concept as it applies to medical care for folks. And then again, as you point out, I mean, part of this is just the cultural components of the organization. Do you take time to celebrate and to express gratitude? And we start all of our meetings with monument moments, where we share great outcomes and we share wow cards with each other. And many of those are they're throughout the teams, and so many of those are shared with financial folks who are able to, to get a win for for a patient, get in some cases it what would have been maybe a rather emotionally dramatic event to move a surgical patient, is now celebrated by all members of the team, because we've managed to, to avert a financial disaster for a family, and instead, get them appropriately cleared for a procedure and get that done without causing that financial harm to them. So we I think it's important to celebrate those.
I think, I particularly enjoy that last comment, but I think all of your thoughts there are very salient, and the team model for care and moving towards that, I think, definitely expands that purpose-driven element that I was talking about. Let's go back to the book and specifically now the creation of the book. Did you start writing this after the COVID-19 pandemic struck in 2020? Did you write it before and then you got delayed by having to deal with all the ramifications of COVID? And tell me a little bit about your process there and how that came to be.
I think the importance, certainly, of the topic became more apparent to me over time, and part of that's probably just my age and becoming more reflective as I get older in terms of what are those elements that have importance that maybe I hadn't spent as much time focusing on in the past. But certainly COVID-19, brought this topic to the forefront as something I wouldn't have thought that it would have made a very interesting book, maybe an article, but certainly, but probably not to the book level until COVID hit, and then I think the importance of considering competition in its various manifestations, rather than just a straight sort of competition for individual units of business, but competition on a larger level in terms of legitimacy and market position of an organization. Those things became much more apparent during COVID. We had because there was definitely a shift there and an immediate demand on hospitals and on certain providers within the system that maybe had previously been somewhat more or less valued perhaps than other specialists. And suddenly, when the country was facing, what they, at least initially, and what ended up being, unfortunately, in many cases, life-threatening situations, that suddenly those elements of competition became more apparent. For
Right.
instance, sort of one of the things that we've done, speaking back to sort of applying general business principles, bringing them into medicine, was to take a lot of the slack out of the system, right? Just in time inventory, moving away from large warehouse inventory costs, and having the supply chain become more, at least at the time, more readily available to us in a just-in-time fashion, and decreasing that investment. And I think, and also in decreasing the number of unused beds in a facility, and running more lean in terms of nurse to patient ratios, and physician to patient ratios, those kind of things. And those were all good. It was good to become more efficient. Unfortunately, what we didn't think about was, well, what if we get stressed? What's the answer then?
Mm-hmm.
And the answer, for that can't live. And this is what we're experiencing now. When that answer lives totally on the provider side, I mean, we can respond, at least, not ideally, but we can respond. But then we pay for it later, which is kind of what we're seeing now, I think, where we did respond. We did open up, opportunities for beds. We deferred, obviously, to do that. We deferred some of our elective care and some other things that we would normally have maybe hospitalized people for. And so our response was less than ideal, because we really didn't have any slack built into the system.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we were to think back and to think, well, along the way here, did I personally ever really engage my payers in our risk management planning? No, it wouldn't have occurred to me to do that. Now it does.
Yeah.
Now when I think about, risk management, I think about, a much more globally, what the impacts would be, and, how would we be able to respond without our payer partners working with us to respond to some of these crises. And I think that's just, the country itself just didn't seem to be well suited to respond to that. Insurance companies they weren't trying to, but their profit margins went way up during that time, because all the elective services went down. And there was really no defined means in these for-profit dividend paying companies of really curbing that, or of finding a way to share that back with the providers, who were, of course, taking losses, trying to modify there are already very lean and efficient processes, and to modify those to deal with the crisis then created a problem. So again, the federal dollar is certainly very helpful, but also very short term for what has turned out to be now a much more long term problem. So I think that, those are some of the aspects around considering the competitive position around those resources within our strategic plan in a more global sense that I hadn't thought of before.
So you're seeing this in COVID. You feel like this topic needs to be written about. You decide to sit down and write it, but you're a medical doctor. You're, a physician leader in a large organization, at least maybe not multi-billion-dollar healthcare system. In healthcare, probably more of a moderate size, but compared to, John's Diner, down the street or whatever, a large organization in your community. You're doing your hiking and your mountain biking and involved in the community, as we talked about during your intro. How'd you make time? What's your, a lot of people out there want to do more. Maybe they want to write a book specifically, or just go back to school or something like that. How did you find time to get this achieved?
Good question. How did I find that time? I think, there's something usually probably gives, I suppose, when you make these decisions on where to focus your time. I think what I try to do professionally each year is I sit down on each calendar year and then refresh that mid-year, which is a fiscal year for us as well, and both professionally and personally say what are my goals and what do I want to spend my time on for this particular year. And you're right, this had been on my list for a few years actually, and it did get put off for a while. And you also go through that phase where you think, well, how relevant is this point? Or again, and then like we talked about, COVID maybe helped solidify that there's some relevance to the concept. But otherwise, it was really just a matter of sitting down. In my case, finding a good publisher who can say, you're a pretty easygoing, folksy talker, speaker when you have conversations, and yet when you write, you write like you're writing a boring clinical article that no one's going to want to read. So it's also just getting a lot of good advice, I think, and talking with other authors out there, and who went through the same process, and that was probably the part that comes out of this that's the most rewarding, is the opportunity to meet you, talk to people like you, and other opportunities that speaking bring. Then you meet different people, and those are inspiring, and those are a source of energy, I guess. And so as I think about my resource commitments for the year, for my personal time, it's you try to create a balance between work and the things I want to accomplish at work, and family life, and my personal development, both and as I get older, maintenance, I guess, really of health, maybe not improving, but maintenance. And trying to find the best I can those synergies that link to each other. So working on this, on the book, was a way for me to consolidate a lot of my own strategic thinking relative that is more directly applicable to the job that I have right now as well. So I just find that that they really went hand in hand for me, and so I considered it sort of almost like a CME effort in some ways, because the benefits that I have gotten and continue to get out of it by meeting and talking to smart people like you just continue to enhance my professional development, which helps me here at work.
So often, usually in the last third of my conversations with people, I try to ask them questions about their career, or how they get there, or advice that they would have to others entering their career. I'd like to wrap us up with a different version of that type of career question, which is, you and I have sat here and kind of geeked out a little bit over healthcare sustainability and healthcare strategy, and hopefully maybe some folks have stuck with us to the end. But somebody's out there, young, trying to pick a career, middle-aged, looking for a different career, and maybe considering healthcare. And they listen to us and they hear about all the headwinds, and that it needs a title change, and that there's challenges, and that we're fighting merely for legitimacy. Would you even advise people to get into our industry? And if yes, I hope not no, but if yes, are there things to be aware of or to look out for as they undertake that journey?
Yeah, so it certainly would encourage anyone who has an interest. The job security. We talk about the structure of healthcare relative to the spend. We know that administrative costs are excessive. We know that that there are issues and some misaligned. Probably incentives that are built into the system that we want to correct, and those are certainly things that will capture people as they go through their educational process as they start their career in healthcare. And for a few of us, it becomes, sort of infectious, the sort of policy sort of component of it, and the desire to create change at that level that we feel will create, sort of global improvements in our delivery system. But the truth is, at its base, the care delivery components are pretty close to the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy in terms of needs. So it's hard to imagine that there's not going to be a time when there's not lots of work for a respiratory therapist, or a pharmacy technician, or a nurse, or any type of physician, or APP. So it's just, I think from a, certainly if you were looking at it as a parent wanting something stable, or something that's going to be around for generations in terms of the need, healthcare certainly fits that need. And even, if you look at the business side of it, regardless, I mean, you look at systems that have gone to socialized. There's still a business accounting component to socialized medicine. It still comes down to allocation of scarce resources that require a partnership, between business and clinical folks in order to get the delivery figured out. So, I think it's certainly safe in that aspect. What it looks like, and I think what the some of the nuances of how the systems develop in such a way to work with communities, for instance. I think right now what we see, there's some great examples out there of payers, providers, and communities working together. Some of the blue zones type of work that we've seen in the country. I think England has the Frome project, where they've integrated a lot of social connections within their communities with the with the National Health Service that they have over there, and then the primary care office there in town. So there's some great examples out there, of that occurring. And I mean that gives me hope that that on the policy side, we can help make a better future for those people that do get into it. But but I think that the day-to-day and immediate gratification that you get from helping someone probably occurs in every system. Whether it's a fee-for-service or a completely socialized system. There's probably not a lot of difference in that actual act of helping someone and receiving the positive feedback that you get from that. So yeah, I think in that sense, I mean, and those are the things that drive people into medicine. It's probably we have such a complex business. I'm sure you nor I knew exactly what we were getting into, right? When we got into this, and some days it's easy to say at the end of the week, I'm not sure I would have if I didn't understood some of the complexity in this. But the truth is, the complexity is something that we've understood over time, and that we have undertaken these sort of roles and an opportunity to maybe influence those. But the basic part of our work, as it relates to patient care, really doesn't change across that. And so, yeah, I would highly recommend that. And it's hard to imagine another job that just naturally has that sort of gratitude kind of built in to the work that you do on a daily basis.
Well, that makes sense. And on that mostly positive tail end about, making positive impacts for people entering the field, I think that's a good spot to wrap up. So we've been talking about it for just under an hour. Share with everybody the name of your book and where they can find it. If I know it might be a little bit specialized, but if they want to buy it, where can they find it?
Yeah, it's Rules of the Race. And really, so I wrote it, there are some healthcare examples in there, but there's also a lot of non-healthcare examples, and tried to make the book fairly appealing to anyone that's involved in organizational strategic planning. So whether that be a startup, mom and pop business, or a large organization, it should, hopefully there's some at least stimulating thought in there, and look forward to that creating some feedback for me on that, so that I can learn from that as well, which is the real purpose of the book for me. So we'll be launching the book formally in late June, early July, and be out on Amazon and be able to achieve it that way, either in hardback, softcover, or hopefully also we'll be getting it out on an electronic version as well as audiobook.
Awesome. Well, Dr. Brad Archer, thank you for being with me here on No Bad Questions.
Thank you, David.